Daniel Kang couldn't believe his own eyes when he saw her standing near the railing of the East River ferry dock. Monica Lawson, the employee he had dismissed without a second thought just hours earlier for being 20 minutes late. The woman whose red-eyed pleas he had ignored as he stared at the ticking hands of his Patek Philippe, declaring that rules were rules. He had expected her to slink away into the gray Brooklyn skyline, another name erased from his corporate payroll. But it wasn't the sight of the woman he had crushed that made the blood in the veins of the coldest man in New York turn to ice. It was the frail, elderly stranger she was shielding with her own thin coat. The old woman clung to Monica's arm with a desperate, familiar grip. The kind of grip Daniel hadn't felt since the day a similar stranger pulled his own mother from the twisted wreckage of a car years ago. As the wind whipped off the water, Monica didn't look like a defeated single mother. She looked like a sentinel. She whispered reassurances to the stranger, her shoulders squared against the biting chill, acting not out of obligation, but out of a quiet, relentless heroism. Daniel stood frozen on the deck of his private vessel, a man who ruled a multi-billion-dollar empire with a silken glove, now feeling the air grow thin in his lungs. His heart pounded hard against his ribs as the ferry captain rushed toward him, his face ashen. "Sir, that elderly lady she's helping?" the captain stammered, his voice barely audible over the roar of the engines. "She's the one. The woman who saved your mother's life during the accident. Monica wasn't just late, sir. She was keeping the person your family owes everything to from freezing on this dock." Daniel felt as if a fist had driven straight into his chest. Looking through the crowd of commuters, he saw Monica lift her head, feeling the weight of his stare. In her eyes, he didn't see the panic of a fired employee, but the weary dignity of a woman who knew a secret he was only now beginning to understand. A secret about debt, honor, and a life he had almost destroyed. The coldness he had used as a shield for years began to crack, poised on the edge of an eruption that would change both of their lives forever. Daniel stood on the polished teak deck of the ferry, the roar of the engines fading into a dull hum that matched the throbbing in his temples. He didn't look back at the dock, but the image of Monica Lawson shielding that frail woman was seared into his retina like a brand. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the exhausted, red-eyed woman he had dismissed with a flick of his wrist, now transformed into a guardian for a stranger. "Captain," Daniel said, his voice a jagged whisper that sliced through the salt air. The ferry captain, a veteran named Miller who had served the Kang family for 2 decades, stepped forward, his cap gripped tightly in his weathered hands. "Tell me again," Daniel commanded, finally turning to face him. "Tell me exactly who that woman is." Miller swallowed hard, his face pale under the amber glow of the cabin lights. "Sir, it's Mrs. Gable. She's lived in the shadows of the harbor for years, but I'd know her anywhere. 20 years ago, when the car went over the embankment near the old pier, she was the one who went into the water before the sirens even started. She pulled your mother out, sir. She held her head above the tide until the paramedics arrived. Your family called her the ferry angel for months, but she refused every reward. She just vanished back into her life." The blood in Daniel's veins, usually as controlled and cold as liquid nitrogen, seemed to turn to ice. He reached out, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the railing. He had built a multi-billion-dollar empire on the foundation of his family's survival. A survival he now realized was bought with the courage of the woman he had just treated like a discarded line item on a spreadsheet. "And Monica?" Daniel asked, the name feeling heavy and foreign on his tongue. "She wasn't just late, Mr. Kang," Miller said, a trace of quiet defiance entering his tone. "Mrs. Gable had a fall on the platform. The crowds were pushing past, but that young lady," she stopped. "She missed 3 ferries to keep that woman calm. She gave up her own coat to keep her warm while they waited for the medicine to take effect. She wasn't being irresponsible, sir. She was doing what no one else would." Daniel felt as if a fist had been driven straight into his chest. He looked down at his Patek Philippe, the ticking seconds now sounding like a countdown to his own moral bankruptcy. He had prided himself on seeing everything, on being the coldest, most observant man in any room. Yet he had been blind to the quiet, relentless heroism of the woman who had been keeping his family's blood debt alive while he obsessed over punctuality. The crack in his stoic shield widened, an eruption of guilt and shame poised to change everything. The next morning, the Manhattan skyline was shrouded in a persistent gray drizzle that seemed to mirror the heavy gloom settling in Daniel's chest. He didn't take his usual black sedan to the office. Instead, he drove himself, crossing the bridge into a part of Brooklyn where the glass towers of progress gave way to crumbling brick and the tangled shadows of rusted fire escapes. He had Monica's personnel file memorized. The address he had ignored for months now felt like a destination of penance. Daniel stepped out of his car, his handmade Italian shoes clicking sharply against the cracked pavement. The air here didn't smell of expensive espresso and ambition. It smelled of damp asphalt, exhaust, and the weary scent of 1,000 people just trying to survive the day. He stood before a dilapidated tenement building, its entrance guarded by a door that didn't quite close and a hallway that swallowed the dim light. He didn't find Monica in her apartment. A neighbor, a woman with suspicious eyes and a tired smile, told him she was likely at the corner bodega, trying to negotiate credit for milk. Daniel walked down the block, his presence like a foreign object in a delicate ecosystem. He spotted her through the fogged windows of the small grocery store. She looked smaller here, stripped of her professional blazer, huddled in the same thin coat he had seen on the ferry. She was holding a toddler in one arm, a boy with curious eyes, while her daughter gripped her hand. Monica was speaking softly to the man behind the counter, her shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow. Daniel watched as she carefully counted out a handful of loose change, only to have the man shake his head and slide a gallon of milk back toward the shelf. The look that crossed Monica's face wasn't anger. It was a profound, crushing exhaustion. She simply nodded, pulled her children closer and began to walk toward the exit. Daniel stepped back into the shadows of a doorway, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had fired her for being 20 minutes late, never once questioning if those minutes were spent choosing between a bus fare and a meal, or if she had walked miles just to save a few cents for the children now shivering at her side. He saw the fairy angel's quiet heroism reflected in the way Monica kissed her daughter's forehead to distract her from the cold. The rejection lingered in the air like a bitter frost as Daniel watched Monica's silhouette disappear into the urban haze. Her words had done more than bruise his ego. They had stripped away the delusion that his success made him righteous. Driven by a desperate need for a moral compass he had long ago discarded, Daniel drove to the one place that still felt untainted by his corporate coldness. His mother's estate on the outskirts of the city. The house was filled with the soft amber light of late afternoon, a stark contrast to the sterile shadows of his Manhattan penthouse. He found his mother, Choi-hee, sitting in the sunroom, her gaze fixed on the garden. Though time had been kind to her, the faint, jagged scar near her temple remained, a permanent map of the day the world almost ended for the Kang family. "You look like a man carrying a mountain, Daniel," she said softly, her voice the only thing that she passed him. Oblivious to his presence, Daniel felt the last of his cold, corporate armor shatter. He wasn't looking at a line item or a tardy employee. He was looking at the living legacy of the woman who had saved his mother, a woman who was drowning in the shadows while he sat in a throne of glass. The debt wasn't just a number anymore. It was the hollow look in Monica's eyes, and Daniel knew he would have to tear down his entire world to fix what he had broken. Monica's life was not a series of unfortunate events. It was a relentless, silent war where the enemy had no face and the ground was always shifting. As she walked her children back to their cramped apartment, her mind drifted to the months that had led to that final icy confrontation in Daniel Kang's office. She remembered the nights she had spent hunched over her kitchen table, the light of a single flickering bulb illuminating her meticulous notes on the company's logistics. She had been more than a clerk. She had been a shadow architect, finding efficiencies in the supply chain that saved the firm thousands, all while her own bank account hovered in the red. She recalled the morning 3 months ago when the heating pipe had burst, soaking her children's only winter coats. Instead of calling out, she had stayed up until 4 a.m. drying them with a hairbrush and a prayer, only to run 3 miles to the office because the subway had stalled. She had arrived drenched in sweat, her lungs burning, only to receive a formal reprimand from a manager who didn't even know her name. Her work ethic was a suit of armor she wore to hide the fraying edges of her spirit. The obstacles were never-ending, like waves crashing against a crumbling levee. There was the time Emma had a fever of 103, and Monica had to coordinate a network of neighbors just to ensure she wasn't left alone for the hour it took to finish the quarterly audit. There were the missed meals she disguised as not being hungry, so Ethan could have a second helping of pasta. Every day was a tactical maneuver. calculating the exact second she needed to leave to catch the bus, the precise amount of detergent needed to stretch the box another week, the strength required to keep her voice steady when she wanted to scream at the sky. She had respected Daniel Kang. She had seen his discipline as a mirror of her own, a shared language of hard work and results. She hadn't wanted his pity, she had wanted his recognition. But the rules are rules mantra he lived by was a luxury for those who didn't have to choose between a ticking clock and a dying stranger. As she tucked her children into bed, the silence of the apartment felt heavy with the weight of her defeat. She had fought the war with everything she had, but in the end, the coldest man in New York had looked at her scars and seen only a lack of punctuality. She didn't know that the shadows she had lived in were finally beginning to reach toward the light. The following morning, Daniel's silver Maybach sat idling like a silent predator at the curb of Monica's crumbling tenement. He had waited since dawn, his fingers drummed rhythmically against the leather upholstery, each second feeling like a sharp rebuke from the watch he usually worshipped. When Monica finally emerged, her children in tow, she didn't see the man who had broken her life. She only saw another obstacle blocking her path to the bus stop. Daniel stepped out, the crisp line of his charcoal suit a jarring contrast to the rusted iron gates behind him. "Monica," he said, his voice stripped of its usual corporate edge. It sounded hollow, almost pleading. She stopped dead, her grip tightening on her children's hands. The exhaustion in her eyes flared into a cold, hard defensive wall. "Mr. Kang," she replied, her voice steady but brittle. "If you're here to remind me that I'm still fired, you're wasting your time. I already know the rules." "I was wrong," Daniel said quickly, stepping toward her. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a thick envelope, the heavy vellum embossed with the company's gold seal. "I've reviewed your performance files. The efficiencies you created, the dedication you showed. I didn't see it. I've reinstated you. With a senior director title and a salary increase that is triple your previous pay. There's a signing bonus in here to cover all your debts." He held the envelope out, expecting the relief, the tears of gratitude, the immediate surrender of a woman drowning in bills. Instead, Monica looked at the gold seal as if it were a poisoned leaf. She didn't reach for it. She didn't even blink. "You think this is about money?" she asked softly, and the quietness of her voice was more devastating than a scream. "You sat in that glass office and watched me break. You looked at my face, saw my struggle, and decided I wasn't worth 20 minutes of your time. You didn't care about the rules, until they gave you an excuse to feel superior." "Monica, I know about the ferry," he stammered, his composure slipping. "I know who you saved. It's a debt A debt." Monica cut him off, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "So that's what this is. You're not sorry you hurt me. You're just sorry I'm connected to someone you actually respect. You want to buy your way out of the shame of being the man who fired his mother's savior." She stepped around him, her head held high, pulling her children along the cracked pavement. "Keep your money, Mr. Kang. You can't buy back the dignity you took from me in that office. My time is worth everything now, and I won't spend another second of it on a man who only sees people when they have a price tag attached to their souls." Daniel stood alone on the sidewalk, the heavy envelope still extended in his hand. For the first time in his life, the most powerful man in New York realized that there were some debts that couldn't be settled with a check, and some fires that even the coldest ice couldn't put out. It could still reach the person behind the CO. Daniel sat at her feet, his shoulders sagging. "I did something, Mother. I followed the rules, but I broke a person. A woman who... Miller says she was helping Mrs. Gable." He went perfectly still. The mention of the name seemed to pull a hidden thread from the past. She reached out, her fingers tracing the scar on her temple. "Mrs. Gable," she whispered, her eyes clouding with a memory that was 20 years old but as vivid as a fresh wound. "Do you remember what I told you, Daniel? About the water?" Daniel nodded, the lump in his throat making it hard to swallow. "Everyone was screaming," she said, her voice trembling with the ghost of that old terror. "The car was sinking and the metal was groaning. I couldn't breathe. But then a hand reached through the broken glass. It wasn't the hand of a hero from a story. It was a rough, working-class hand, scarred and strong. She didn't ask who I was. She didn't ask how much money I had. She just gripped me and promised she wouldn't let go." She looked at her son, her gaze piercing through his charcoal suit. "That woman gave me my life because she saw a human being in need, not a balance sheet. If you have hurt someone who carries that same spirit, then you haven't just broken a rule, Daniel. You have insulted the very mercy that allowed you to exist. Daniel felt the scorching weight of her words. He realized then that Monica's lateness wasn't a flaw in her character. It was the highest expression of it. He had spent his life building walls of glass and steel, but he was standing on ground bought and paid for by the selfless sacrifice of women like Mrs. Gable and Monica Lawson. He stood up, the ice in his heart finally melting into a flood of terrifying clarity. He didn't just owe Monica a job, he owed her his soul. While Daniel was drowning in the echoes of his mother's past, the sharks in the Manhattan business world had already scented blood in the water. Choi Kang, Daniel's most bitter rival and a man whose ambition was as sharp as a razor, did not believe in coincidences. He had seen the silver Maybach idling in the slums of Brooklyn, and he had seen the footage of the ice-cold CO standing humbled on a cracked sidewalk. To Choi, Monica Lawson wasn't a woman to be respected. She was a weapon to be wielded. Monica was leaving a secondary job interview at a small, cramped warehouse when a sleek midnight blue Bentley pulled up to the curb. The tinted window slid down with a mechanical purr, revealing Choi's predatory smile. He didn't look like Daniel. Where Daniel was a wall of ice, Choi was a flickering, dangerous flame. "Ms. Lawson," Choi said, his voice smooth as silk. "I believe you've had a rather unpleasant encounter with my colleague, Daniel Kang. A man who fires heroes for being 20 minutes late doesn't deserve the empire he sits upon, don't you agree?" Monica stopped, her eyes narrowing. She was tired, her feet ached, and the weight of the rejection she had handed Daniel was still a heavy stone in her pocket. "I have nothing to say to you, Mr. Choi. I'm done with men in expensive suits." "I'm not here to offer you a job, Monica," Choi replied, stepping out of the car. He leaned against the polished door, his gaze fixing on her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "I'm here to offer you justice. Daniel is vulnerable right now. His board of directors is whispering about his sudden distraction. His mother's legacy is the only thing keeping him afloat. You have the power to sink him. Sign an affidavit detailing his harassment and the wrongful termination. Give me the ammunition to strip him of his chairmanship, and I will ensure you and your children never have to worry about a ferry ticket or a gallon of milk again." He held out a gold-plated pen, the metal gleaming like a trap. Monica looked at it, and for a fleeting second, the image of Daniel's arrogant face in the office flashed before her. She remembered the humiliation, the red-eyed shame, and the way he had ignored her pleas. Revenge was a warm, tempting blanket in the biting cold of her reality. "Think about it, Monica," Choi whispered, his voice laced with the poison of shared resentment. "Why settle for a raise when you can have his throne? He broke you for a rule. Now you can break him for the truth." Monica looked from the gold pen to the dark, churning waters of the river in the distance. The war was no longer silent. It had moved into the light, and she was standing at the center of a battlefield where the stakes were no longer just her dignity, but the very soul of the man who had tried to buy hers. The following morning, the river was a slate of churning gray as Daniel returned to the East River terminal. He didn't come in his armored sedan or surrounded by his usual phalanx of security. He arrived alone, his expensive coat unbuttoned, the wind catching his hair as he scanned the crowd of commuters. He found her seated on a weathered wooden bench near the end of the pier, Mrs. Gable. She looked even more fragile in the daylight, her hands trembling as she adjusted a wool scarf that looked suspiciously like the one Monica had been wearing the day she was fired. As Daniel approached, she looked up, her faded eyes sharpening with a recognition that went back decades. "You have your mother's brow," she whispered, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "But you have your father's iron. It's a dangerous combination, Daniel Kang." Daniel sat beside her, the pride that had been his only companion for years finally deserting him. "I heard you were on the ferry that morning," he said, his voice thick with a humility he was still learning to inhabit. "I heard Monica Lawson helped you. I treated her poorly because of the time she lost." Mrs. Gable let out a soft, rattling sigh and reached out to pat his hand. Her skin felt like parchment, yet her grip was surprisingly steady. "Time is a funny thing to people like you, Daniel. You count it in seconds and dollars. But that girl, she counts it in heartbeats." She turned to face him fully, the wind whistling between them. "She wasn't just late because I fell. She was late because after she helped me up, she saw a young man on the platform, a boy no older than Ethan, who was about to jump. He was standing too close to the edge, his eyes vacant, the world having finally broken him. Monica didn't just stay with me. She stayed with him. She talked to him for 20 minutes, Daniel. She told him he was seen, that he mattered, that the sun would come up again even if it felt like an eternal night. She missed those ferries because she was busy saving a life you didn't even notice was in danger. Daniel felt the air leave his lungs as if he had been struck. He had obsessed over 20 minutes of lost productivity, while Monica had been performing a miracle in the shadows of his own commute. She hadn't just saved his mother's savior. She had continued the cycle of mercy that his own cold rules had attempted to extinguish. She never told me, Daniel whispered, his head bowing. Why would she? Mrs. Gable replied, a sad smile touching her lips. True grace doesn't come with a receipt, Daniel. It only comes with a price. And Monica Lawson has been paying yours for a very long time. As the ferry whistle shrieked in the distance, Daniel realized that his corporate throne was a hollow fortress. He had judged a woman for being late to a job, never realizing she was exactly on time for a soul. The blood debt wasn't just a memory, it was a living, breathing weight, and he knew now that a simple raise would never be enough to balance the scales. The cold rain of the previous days had turned into a biting, crystalline wind that whistled through the gaps in Monica's apartment windows. Inside the small, drafty kitchen, Monica sat at the table, her head in her hands. The gold-plated pen Choi Kang had offered felt like a heavy weight in her mind, a siren song of easy revenge. But her thoughts were interrupted by a rhythmic thumping from the hallway outside. It wasn't the aggressive knock of a landlord or the heavy tread of the city. It was the sound of something being dragged, followed by a soft, hesitant rap on the wood. When Monica opened the door, she froze. Daniel Kang stood in the dim, flickering light of the hallway. Gone was the charcoal designer suit. He wore a simple dark sweater and thick work trousers, his hands smudged with soot and grease. Behind him sat two large industrial-grade space heaters and a stack of weather-stripping kits. What are you doing here, Daniel? Monica whispered, her voice tired rather than angry. I told you your money can't fix this. I'm not here as the CEO, Daniel said, his voice low and raspy. He didn't wait for an invitation, but he didn't push past her either. He simply knelt on the cold linoleum floor, pulling a screwdriver and a thermal sealant from a small toolbox. I'm here because I realized that while I was obsessing over seconds, your children were shivering. Mrs. Gable told me about the boy at the pier, Monica. I know why you were late, and I know that no amount of triple salary can warm a room that the world has left to freeze. Monica watched in stunned silence as the man who commanded thousands of employees crawled across her floor. He didn't call for an assistant, he didn't delegate the task. With focused, clumsy determination, he began to seal the cracks in the window frames where the winter air poured in. He worked in a silence that was thick with the weight of 1,000 unspoken apologies. When he finished the first window, he moved to the second, his movements becoming more rhythmic. Emma and Ethan peered from the bedroom doorway, watching the expensive man fix their home. Daniel stopped for a moment, looking at Ethan, and for the first time, a genuine, soft smile touched his face. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, sturdy toy ferry, not gold-plated but carved from simple wood. For the next time you go to the water, Daniel said, sliding it across the floor toward the boy. Monica felt a strange, terrifying warmth bloom in her chest. She saw the smudge of dirt on Daniel's forehead and the way his hands shook slightly from the exertion. He wasn't trying to buy her forgiveness. He was trying to earn the right to stand in the same room as her. As the heaters hummed to life, filling the apartment with a golden, artificial summer, the ice that had protected Daniel's heart for decades finally shattered, leaving behind a man who was finally learning that the greatest service is performed without a witness or a paycheck. The following morning, the warmth of Monica's apartment felt like a distant dream as Daniel stepped into the predatory chill of the Kang Holdings boardroom. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the static energy of an impending coup. At the head of the mahogany table sat the elder directors, men who had served his father and who viewed human emotion as a terminal illness in business. We've seen the reports, Daniel, Director Han began, his voice a dry rasp that echoed off the floor-to-ceiling glass. He slid a tablet across the table, displaying a grainy image of Daniel's Maybach parked in the Brooklyn slums. The CEO of the East Coast's most disciplined conglomerate, spending his nights in a tenement building? playing handyman for a terminated employee. Daniel didn't flinch. He sat at the head of the table, his hands clasped, but for the first time he wasn't looking at the stock tickers scrolling across the wall. He was looking at the faces of the men who had helped him build a fortress of ice. Our reputation is built on the Kang standard, another director added, his tone laced with a biting condescension. Rules, Daniel. Punctuality. Unwavering focus. Since the ferry incident, you've missed 3 key acquisitions. You've let a blood debt distract you from the bottom line. The shareholders are hearing whispers that the coldest man in New York has finally melted. I am modernizing our standard, Daniel replied, his voice low and unshakable. I am learning that a company that cannot see the humanity of its workers is a company built on sand. Monica Lawson was late because she was doing the work of a hero, work that saved the very woman who allowed this family to exist. If our rules cannot accommodate that, then our rules are broken. A cold, mocking laughter rippled through the room. The board doesn't pay you to be a philosopher, Daniel. We pay you to be a machine. If you cannot return to the man you were, the man who fired that woman without a second thought, then we will find someone who can. You have 48 hours to resolve this distraction, or we will move for a vote of no confidence. Daniel felt the walls of his empire closing in. For years, these men had been his allies because they shared his coldness. Now that same ice was being turned against him. He realized with terrifying clarity that Choi Kang wasn't his only enemy. He was fighting the very machine he had perfected. As he left the boardroom, the ticking of his watch no longer sounded like a measure of success, but like the countdown to a sacrifice. He was being asked to choose between his throne and his soul, and for the first time the choice wasn't as simple as a balance sheet. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was a sea of shimmering silk, clinking crystal, and whispered betrayals. It was the annual Kang Foundation Gala, a night designed to celebrate the family's legacy, but tonight the air felt brittle, as if the entire room were waiting for the ice to break. Daniel stood near the podium, his face a mask of practiced stoicism, yet his eyes constantly drifted toward the grand entrance. He knew the board was watching his every move, waiting for a sign of the softness that would justify his removal. The heavy oak doors swung open, and the room fell into a suffocating silence. Choi Kang entered, his predatory smile gleaming under the crystal chandeliers. But it was the woman on his arm who caused the collective breath of New York's elite to hitch. Monica Lawson looked like a ghost haunting a masquerade. Choi had dressed her in a gown of midnight velvet that cost more than her apartment building, but no amount of silk could hide the raw, defensive fire in her eyes. She walked with her head high, though her hand trembled slightly where it rested on Choi's sleeve. "Daniel," Choi called out, his voice carrying effortlessly across the silent ballroom. "I noticed someone was missing from your guest list. I thought it was only right to bring the woman you discarded back into the light. After all, the city deserves to see the true face of the Kang standard." The board members exchanged sharp, satisfied glances. This was the trap. Choi wasn't just bringing Monica here. He was presenting the evidence of Daniel's cruelty to the very people who held his future in their hands. He leaned in close to Monica, his whisper loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Go on, Monica. Tell them. Tell them how the man on that stage looked at your red eyes and told you that you were worth nothing because of 20 minutes. Daniel felt the scorching weight of 100 stares. He looked down from the podium, seeing Monica standing in the center of the lion's den, a weapon being wielded by his enemy. He saw the gold-plated pen she had refused, the heaters he had installed, and the wooden fairy toy Ethan had gripped. He realized that Choi didn't care about Monica's justice any more than the board cared about her heroism. To them, she was just a catalyst for destruction. As the cameras began to flash, capturing Monica's silhouette against the opulence she had been denied, Daniel realized the countdown had ended. He could stay silent and protect his throne, or he could step into the fire and protect the woman he had wronged. The coldest man in New York took a long, steady breath, and for the first time in his life he didn't check his watch. He walked toward the edge of the stage, leaving the safety of the podium behind. The silence in the ballroom was so absolute that Daniel could hear the ghost of his mother's heartbeat in his ears, a rhythmic reminder of the debt he had almost forgotten. He stepped down from the stage, moving past the security detail and the rows of stunned directors, until he stood on the same level as Monica. Up close, the velvet dress Choi had forced upon her looked like a shroud, and the raw, exhausted dignity in her eyes made his heart hammer against his ribs with a violence he hadn't felt in decades. Choi Kang's smirk deepened, his hand still possessively hovering near Monica's arm. "Go on, Daniel," Choi provoked, his voice a low, lethal purr. "Tell them why she's really here. Tell them how the great Daniel Kang treats the people who keep his city running." Daniel didn't look at Choi. He didn't look at the flashing cameras or the board members who were already drafting his termination. He looked only at Monica. "I stood in my office 3 days ago and told this woman she was worth nothing because she was 20 minutes late," Daniel began, his voice surprisingly steady, though it lacked its usual icy edge. It was rough, human, and stripped of the corporate armor he had worn like a second skin. He turned toward the crowd, the microphones on the periphery picking up every syllable. "I prided myself on rules. I thought punctuality was a measure of character. But I was blind. Monica Lawson wasn't late because of laziness or irresponsibility. She was late because she was saving a life on a ferry dock. The life of the woman who saved my own mother 20 years ago." A collective gasp rippled through the room like a wave. Daniel walked to the center of the floor, standing in the middle of the light. "I used my power to crush a hero because her heroism didn't fit into my schedule. I saw her red eyes and I saw her exhaustion, and I chose to see a failure instead of a miracle." He paused, his gaze returning to Monica, who stood frozen, her defensive fire flickering into something closer to shock. "The Kang standard is broken," Daniel declared, the words echoing off the high ceilings. "A man who cannot see the soul behind the clock is not fit to lead. I am not standing here to defend my position. I am standing here to confess that the coldest man in New York was a coward who hid behind a watch to avoid seeing the world's pain." He stepped toward Monica and, in front of every camera and every enemy he had ever made, he bowed his head. It wasn't a shallow, professional gesture. It was a deep, ancient sign of atonement. "I am sorry, Monica. Not just for the job, but for the blindness. You were exactly where you needed to be, and I was the one who was lost." The flashing lights intensified, but the sound of Choi Kang's smirk disappearing was the only thing Daniel heard. He had just set fire to his throne, but as he looked at the tears finally breaking in Monica's eyes, he felt a strange, terrifying peace. The ice was gone, and for the first time, Daniel Kang was finally on time for his own life. The echoes of Daniel's confession hung in the grand ballroom, a heavy, shimmering silence that felt like the moment before a storm breaks. Monica stood in the center of the light, her hand slowly slipping away from Choi Kang's arm as if his touch had suddenly become toxic. She looked at Daniel, still bowed before her, and for the first time she didn't see the iron-willed CEO or the arrogant billionaire. She saw the man who had knelt on her kitchen floor, his hands covered in soot, trying to fix a warmth he had personally extinguished. The board of directors moved with predatory speed. Director Han stepped forward, his face a mask of cold fury. "Daniel Kang, you have admitted to a dereliction of duty and a compromise of the Kang standard. You have put a personal sentiment above the stability of this conglomerate. By your own words, you have rendered yourself unfit." He turned to the crowd, his voice projecting with a practiced, lethal authority. "We will now call for an immediate emergency vote. This distraction ends tonight." Choi Kang's eyes gleamed with the triumph he had chased for a decade. He looked at Monica, leaning in with a hiss of expectation. "Now, Monica, finish him. Tell them his apology is a PR stunt. Tell them he's a liar who only cares about his mother's image. One word from you and he loses everything." Monica looked at Daniel. He didn't look back at the board or plead for his position. He simply remained there, waiting for her judgment, his fate resting entirely on the narrow, fragile shoulders he had once dismissed. Monica felt the weight of the gold-plated pen in her memory, the easy revenge, the comfortable life Choi had promised. But then she felt the warmth of the space heaters in her apartment, and the weight of the small wooden ferry in Ethan's hands. She stepped forward, not toward the cameras but toward Director Han. "You talk about the Kang standard as if it's a law of nature," Monica said, her voice clear and carrying a resonance that silenced the murmurs. "But a standard is only as good as the man who upholds it. Daniel Kang fired me because he was a machine. But he came to my home in the dark, and worked until his hands bled to protect my children because he became a man." She turned to the stunned crowd of shareholders. "You want to remove him because he's soft? I've lived in the shadows of this city my whole life, And I can tell you that there is nothing harder than a man willing to admit he was wrong in front of the world. If you want a machine, hire a clock. If you want a leader, you keep the man who finally learned that the value of a person isn't measured in minutes. A slow, tentative applause began in the back of the room, growing into a roar that Kang couldn't drown out. Monica reached out, her hand resting briefly on Daniel's shoulder. A touch of forgiveness that did more than any board vote ever could. She had chosen not to break the man who had broken her, but to save the man he had become. For the first time, the rules had no power. There was only the truth of the fairy angel's legacy, living on in the light. The aftermath of the gala felt like the first deep breath Daniel had taken in 20 years. The board's attempted coup had collapsed under the weight of Monica's public defense. But more importantly, the Kang standard had been permanently rewritten. In the weeks that followed, the sterile glass corridors of Kang Holdings underwent a quiet revolution. Daniel no longer tracked his employees by the second. He began to track them by their stories. It was Monica who suggested the foundation's name, the Fairy Angel Initiative. It was not merely a charity, but a systematic bridge designed to catch those who, like her, were one flat tire or one sick child away from losing everything. Daniel had donated the initial seed money, a sum that made the financial headlines scream, but Monica provided the soul. She moved from the shadows of the logistics department to the sunlight of the penthouse executive wing, not as a charity case, but as the foundation's co-founder and heart. On a crisp spring morning, the foundation opened its first community center in the heart of the neighborhood Daniel had once viewed only from the windows of his armored car. The building was a renovated warehouse filled with light, communal spaces and a state-of-the-art childcare wing. Daniel stood in the center of the lobby, wearing a simple suit, watching Emma and Ethan run across the new floors. "You're late," Monica said, stepping up beside him. She was holding a clipboard, her eyes bright with a sense of purpose that no velvet dress could ever provide. Daniel looked at his watch, but for the first time he didn't see a deadline. He saw a gift. "I was busy talking to the architect about the next site in the Bronx," he said, a genuine smile touching his lips. "I figured 20 minutes wouldn't hurt." Monica laughed, a sound that finally chased the last of the winter chill from Daniel's heart. They stood together as the doors opened, welcoming in the first group of parents. Single mothers with tired eyes, fathers in worn work boots, all of them carrying the weight of a world that usually didn't have time for them. Daniel realized that this was the true legacy his mother had wanted for him. It wasn't about the skyscrapers or the billions in the bank. It was about the blood debt he was finally paying forward. As he watched Monica greet a woman who looked exactly like she had on the day he fired her, Daniel reached out and squeezed her hand. They weren't just fixing a mistake. They were building a world where no one would ever have to choose between their dignity and their survival. The coldest man in New York had finally found a warmth that didn't come from a heater, but from the simple, relentless act of being human. 1 year had passed since the morning Daniel Kang had stood on a cracked sidewalk in Brooklyn, clutching a gold-sealed envelope and a heart full of ice. Today the glass walls of his office no longer felt like a fortress or a cage. They were simply windows looking out over a city he was finally learning to love. The Kang standard had not disappeared. It had merely been redefined. Punctuality was still a virtue, but Daniel had discovered that the most precious moments in life were the ones that didn't show up on a calendar. He sat at his desk, but his eyes weren't on the stock tickers. They were on a framed photograph of a crowded ferry dock, a gift from Monica to remind him of the day his world had finally cracked open. Beside it sat the small wooden ferry Ethan had outgrown, a silent testament to the night Daniel had chosen to be a man instead of a machine. The door to his office swung open and Monica stepped in. She didn't wait for an assistant to announce her. She belonged here now. She looked at him with an amused glint in her eyes, checking her own watch. A simple, elegant piece he had given her, inscribed with the words, "For the heartbeats, not the seconds." "You're 20 minutes late for our anniversary lunch at the harbor, Daniel," she said, leaning against the doorframe. Daniel stood up, grabbing his coat. A year ago, those words would have been a death sentence in this building. Today they were an invitation. "I was on the phone with the scholarship board," he replied, walking toward her. "There's a young man from the East River District, the same one you talked down from the ledge 2 years ago. He just got accepted into the engineering program. I wanted to make sure his full tuition was covered before I left." Monica's expression softened, the defensive fire of her past long since replaced by a deep, resonant peace. She reached out, taking his hand. "Well," she whispered, "that's the best excuse for being late I've ever heard." They walked through the lobby together, past employees who no longer ducked their heads in fear, but offered genuine smiles. As they stepped onto the street, the spring air was warm and full of the scent of rain and possibility. Daniel realized that his mother's scar, Monica's red eyes, and Mrs. Gable's rough hands were all threads in the same tapestry, a map that had led him out of the cold and into the light. He had spent his life trying to control time, only to find that time was most beautiful when it was given away. He didn't know what challenges the future held, but he knew he was no longer afraid of the commotion at the dock or the unexpected delays of a life lived for others. As the ferry whistle sounded in the distance, calling them home, Daniel Kang finally understood that he wasn't just a CEO or a son or a husband. He was a man who was, for the first time in his life, exactly on time. He leaned down and kissed Monica, the secret they shared. A secret of mercy and second chances, finally changing everything forever. The most immediate lesson is that rules without empathy are hollow. Daniel lived by a rigid standard that prioritized the clock over the human condition. The story teaches that while discipline is important, a truly on-time life is one that recognizes when the needs of another are more urgent than a schedule. Punctuality is a virtue, but mercy is a necessity.